Voilà, bonsoir à toutes et à tous. Alors, en tant que nouveau président de la Société Royale d'économie politique de Belgique, c'est un grand plaisir, un grand honneur de vous accueillir ici ce soir, dans cet endroit qui est un peu exceptionnel. Et j'en profite d'ailleurs pour remercier très chaleureusement nos hôtes du jour, Eric Van Kappenhout et Christelle Buellens, sans qui nous ne serions pas là ce soir. Alors, vous êtes particulièrement nombreux, ce qui nous ravit bien sûr, et ce qui témoigne très vraisemblablement de l'importance et même de la gravité du sujet qui va nous occuper ce soir. Nous allons parler du lien entre activité économique et limites planétaires, avec la question comment concilier ou même comment réconcilier l'activité économique et les limites planétaires. Depuis les années 1970, la question des limites planétaires est posée, notamment à travers le célèbre rapport Meadows de 1972 sur les limites de la croissance. Et depuis les années 90, les travaux du GIEC mettent clairement en lumière les liens entre activité humaine et modification du climat. Aujourd'hui, le changement climatique est directement perceptible un peu partout sur la planète. Et les scientifiques nous alertent constamment sur l'urgence de transformer nos sociétés, à la fois pour viser la neutralité carbone, pour lutter contre les pollutions diverses affectant les sols, l'eau, l'air, et pour régénérer nos écosystèmes. Si elle demeure insuffisante, la prise de conscience des défis environnementaux s'est fortement accrue ces dernières années dans nos sociétés, notamment sous l'impulsion de la jeunesse, descendue dans les rues pour réclamer une justice climatique et un futur prometteur. Dans le même temps, la transition écologique, que beaucoup appellent de leur vœu, tarde à voir le jour, et le sentiment partagé par la population est largement celui d'un fossé entre les discours et les actes. Les réticences au changement demeurent nombreuses aussi. En témoigne l'épisode des Gilets jaunes de 2019, en témoigne le niveau toujours très interpellant des subventions aux énergies fossiles, 13 milliards d'euros en 2022, rien qu'en Belgique. En témoigne aussi la grande difficulté au niveau européen de s'affranchir des pesticides dans l'agriculture. Au niveau mondial, les émissions de gaz à effet de serre, responsables du changement climatique, continuent de croître. Et dans de nombreux pays pauvres, la priorité demeure, de façon très compréhensible, la priorité demeure de façon assez compréhensible, l'amélioration des conditions de vie matérielles de la population, souvent très éloignées de celles de l'Occident. Paradoxalement, les pays pauvres sont les plus susceptibles de souffrir du réchauffement climatique, alors même qu'ils y contribuent le moins. Dans ce contexte, de nombreuses questions se posent toujours quant à la nature et l'ampleur des transformations qu'il nous faut engager. Quels sont les ajustements indispensables pour que la planète demeure non seulement habitable, mais aussi accueillante? Peut-on se permettre d'ajuster notre système actuel et promouvoir une croissance dite verte, ou au contraire, faut-il changer radicalement de paradigme et organiser la décroissance de nos économies? Alors pour aborder ces questions importantes, nous avons avec nous deux jeunes et talentueux économistes. Nous avons d'une part Timothée PARRIQUE, qui est français, qui a étudié l'économie en France et en Suède. Il est l'auteur d'une thèse de doctorat sur la décroissance, et il a publié en 2022 le livre « Ralentir ou périr, l'économie de la décroissance » aux éditions du Seuil. Voici son livre. Nous avons un autre économiste qui est italien, lui, qui s'appelle Alessio TERZI, qui travaille actuellement à la Commission européenne. Il a étudié l'économie en Italie, en Allemagne, au Royaume-Uni, aux États-Unis. Il est également l'auteur d'une thèse de doctorat, mais sur la croissance. Et en 2022, il a publié le livre « Grow for Good » aux éditions de l'Université de Harvard. Tous les deux vont partager avec nous leur vision de la conciliation possible entre l'activité économique et les limites planétaires et les défis environnementaux. Nous allons les écouter, ils ont une présentation chacun, nous allons ensuite faire un débat et ensuite nous allons ouvrir la parole, donner la parole au public pour une séance de questions-réponses. Presentation will be in English, the debate will be in English too, but if you want to raise your question in French or in Dutch, we'll do the translation, the required translation, if necessary. Timothée, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone. That feels like I'm going to do a stand-up comedy show. If you're expecting that, you're going to be disappointed. Maybe can I just like this and move around? Even more stand-up comedy-like. Hello, everyone. So, Timothée PARRIQUE, and since I've got 20 minutes, I'm going to make one small argument, and I'm going to try to demonstrate it as best as I can. And that is, I think, one point we will disagree with Alessio. And my point is that there's a fundamental incompatibility between the pursuit of GDP growth in high-income nations today and in the coming decades and ecological sustainability. That is one argument that has been developed in the growth skeptical literature since the beginning of the 2000s. I've spent my PhD thesis trying to explore the ramifications of the concept of degrowth, but that argument I'm going to present to you is just one link in the chain. But I think one very important link, because if you can right now demonstrate that we can fully decouple economic growth from environmental pressures, then you can just falsify the biophysical necessity for degrowth. So, let me start here with an important point. When I talk about sustainability, I mean respecting planetary boundaries. That's fundamental to remember, because very often when we discuss among economists about sustainability, we rush into carbon business, like decarbonizing an economy. It's all good to decarbonize an economy, but that's only one planetary boundary among many. And that's a simplified framework for Belgium. Anyway, so when you see this, the general message of these kind of figures is that Belgium is overshooting planetary boundaries on several accounts. In ecological economics, we like to speak of carrying capacity. So every ecosystem, you could say, when you look at biodiversity, when you look at soil fertility, when you look at forestation, when you look at climate stability, when you look at water quality, as a specific threshold of do not cross, otherwise that ecosystem might risk dysfunctioning. And so Belgium today is what we call an ecological overshoot. So when I say going back to sustainability, it means getting back to the green zone. Not only for carbon, for all of them. Until we do that, we cannot call that economy sustainable. So sustainable growth is not just carbon neutral growth. No, it's just GDP growth that is decoupled from material footprint, from CO2 emission, from phosphorus and nitrogen use, from the use of water and different kinds of pollution and production of waste, from the impact of land use, ecological footprint in general, impact on biodiversity. That is the challenge, and that is much more difficult to do than just decoupling GDP growth from greenhouse gases, which relatively is a piece of cake, at least in theory, compared to doing that thing which I claim is impossible, which is to grow an economy exponentially, an economy that is already rather big, in the case of Belgium and other high-income countries, while maintaining this in the green zone. So, very few countries have done decoupling studies taking into account a diversity of environmental indicators. This is one that the Spanish government did last year, which the study is not perfect scientifically because it's using indicators that are very difficult to estimate, but the main result, and that's what's interesting, has been just showing that somehow there's a diversity of responses when an economy grows. Because we'll see technological progress is not changing everything at the same speed at once, so you can decouple one thing. So let's say you produce and consume more, and you manage in one region to use less water, or you manage to use less greenhouse gases, but another thing can recouple. It's been the case for the European Union. Its material footprint has increased between 1995 and 2019 by around 9%. So it's the opposite of decoupling, meaning like the increase in your material footprint goes even faster than the rate of economic growth because it's more and more difficult to find metals, biomass, and minerals. So the empirical evidence we have on decoupling, and there's around 1,000 empirical studies on that, and the latest IPCC report has done a synthesis of these studies concerning material use and greenhouse gases only, but that's already something. And there's a scientific consensus that, as of now, we have never witnessed the kind of decoupling we wish we would have today. So the kind of decoupling to get this has never been observed before. So in itself, that's not a sufficient argument to show it will never happen, but that's the start of an argument to be like, okay, well, why has it never happened before? I think Alessio will be arguing, one way for me, I will be arguing because it's theoretically impossible to do so. So that'll be another line of argument. And I'll show you a couple of numbers to estimate how difficult and big that challenge is. So that's a study that was published last week. Now we're just going to focus on greenhouse gases. And when we talk about decoupling and green growth, it's important to be precise. So decoupling means dissociation from GDP growth as a measure of production and consumption, dissociation from a specific environmental indicator. Here are greenhouse gases. So if we look at all countries in the world, and we're trying to find the countries that have managed to reach what we call an absolute decoupling, meaning you want to see GDP goes up and you want to see greenhouse gases go down. Not in relative carbon intensity, screw that, just in real tons of carbon every year, because that's what climate scientists ask us. We economists, we tell them about carbon intensity, they're like, no, we want less tons of CO2 every year. So these 11 countries have managed to do this in the period between 2013 and 2019. So there are a few, but they exist. Now, the important point, and that's the second step, is to look at the speed of that decoupling. And that has been my criticism towards pro-growth environmental economists for a while, that I think are a bit over-optimistic about green growth, is that they take something that is very, very small and assume somehow that it could become huge. So small is one way of showing it. So look at the reduction of greenhouse gas emission from 2013 to 2019, which is extended on preliminary data until 2022. That's what has happened. The red thing is kind of projection of what could happen. Every little semi-dotted line is just a single of these 11 countries, and the large one is kind of the average. That's the business as usual pathways. That's not satisfactory enough for climate scientists who tell us basically that we should be rather having these kind of mitigation rate. When you're a social scientist and you see that's what's been happening and that's what we want now, you're like, is this likely to happen? I'm like, I don't really believe in miracle. So I'm like, we're far from this. In that specific study, they calculate that basically at current speed, these countries would take like 220 years to reach carbon neutrality. So it's just another way of saying that the speed of decoupling we've been witnessing is just very, very tiny. Just another study we're about to publish about Europe, looking here at territorial emissions, so only domestic. And what we figured out is that when you look at yearly emission reduction and not just an average of period of reduction, you realize that actually certain years emissions remain the same, other time they just decrease, but the majority of the reductions during that entire period is concentrated during a very small period of time, which is here in the middle. And so that's just to give you an order of magnitude to understand that these kind of completely bending of the curve we expect is kind of developing after a very heterogeneous process of reduction where it's not even we have this kind of linear where every year we're just lowering emissions. That's not how it happens. Actually, during that period, most year nothing has happened, stabilization of period, and then during certain periods, for some reasons, emission decreased. So now we did some analysis to better understand why did emissions decrease so fast between 2007 and 2014. Maybe some of you will guess why. What comes out of that analysis is that indeed it is more difficult to reduce emissions during years where economic growth is high or accelerating. On the other hand, years where economic growth is low or decelerating are the years where we see the fastest reductions in emissions. If you want to achieve the Fit for 55 minus 55% by 2030, you need at least minus 3.4% per year. That has never been reached except by countries during years of recession. So this is also a good way of just a bit of a wake-up call to be like, is this realistic to expect us to go from, and the minus 3.4% is very, very unambitious target. It's not a science-based target, it's a political European target of the Commission. The science-based target is closer from minus 70% by 2030, and some scientists go even higher, taking equity assumptions into it. I've seen target as high as minus 145%. And here we're talking greenhouse gases. So just even that unambitious target seems so very much difficult to achieve. And what we do in that study is also, if that is true, and I think that's the argument I'm trying to develop here, which doesn't seem that outrageous to say that if you want to decrease here greenhouse gas emission, it's going to be easier and faster to decrease them if you do so while producing and consuming less. That's your two scenarios, you know? And what is true for greenhouse gases, because in theory, it is theoretically possible to fully decouple GDP growth from greenhouse gases. You just have to phase out fossil fuel, and then you're more or less good. But how do you do to fully decouple economic activity from energy use? You can't, or material use. In the sustainability literature, we know that material footprint, which is the extraction of biomass, metals, minerals, and fossil fuels, predetermines 90% of environmental impact. Think air, water pollution, biodiversity loss, degradation of soil and forest and habitat. And so we've seen the recoupling case of Europe, plus 9% since the 90s of material footprint. So here is just, you have a two cases scenario where for greenhouse gases, it's a speed matter. I don't think we will reach these climate targets we have while growing. And so producing and consuming more is a way of accelerating that process that has already started. But for the case of other environmental indicators like material footprint, it's not a matter of speed, it's a matter of direction at all. It's just, if we want to see that thing go down, we need to start producing and consuming less, which is a bit of a twofold argument here to justify the biophysical necessity for degrowth. I'll skip that slide. To just simplify here, my argument is that, and that's an argument we already exchanged before with Alessio when his book came out. You have two positions. It's either you can show that we can grow, keep growing, or even maintain our economy in their current size, so just produce and consume the very same that Belgium produced and consumed last year. Either you can show you can do this while getting back with that safe planetary boundaries. If you can't show that this is possible, plausible, fast enough, whatever, then you only have one other option. I don't see any other. That other option is just to produce and consume less. So there's here a real issue of burden of proof, of who should inherit the burden of proof. Degrowth emerged in 2002, and for decades, I think, green growthers gave us the burden of proof. Like Timothée, why am I using an English accent to pronounce my own name? Timothée. You have, demonstrate that producing and consuming less will decrease the total ecological footprint. Where I'm like, should it not be you demonstrating that somehow producing and consuming more is going to just make us use less resources? I think that shifting of the burden of proof has happened in recent years. But now, I think we can find a way of somehow not overcoming that debate, but also reaching an interesting middle ground of understanding that the smaller the economy is, the easier it is to decouple economic activity from ecological footprint. So another way of saying that is that degrowth accelerates your decoupling because you have less activity to clean out in a certain way, and also if that degrowth is selective because you can just phase out the stuff that is very difficult to green, like very heavy cars, instead of finding a ways of just greening them or just removal, carbon removal, or just compensation. You just find a way of just avoiding that very consumption. So if you cannot show that, for me that leads directly to degrowth as an argument. So there are many ways, many justifications for people arguing for degrowth. Some of them are cultural, some of them are social. Here we've taken the biophysical route, which is historically the one that emerged in the 1970s. That's not my favorite, but I think it's important tonight that we just focus on that basic argument. Because anything else, if you tell me that, yeah, but degrowth, unemployment, public debt, how do we do this, geopolitical relations, poverty, anything you can think of, that's a management problem. If you cannot solve that decoupling thing, you have no choice. You have to produce and consume less. Then all the consequences that come with that, you have to deal in a second kind of debate, in a second way. So that's my way of trying to make this into a number of steps. So the way I think about this is, as long as no one will demonstrate that we can keep producing more while polluting less, then we'll have to accept that degrowth is a scenario, and then it is worth doing what growth skeptical scholars have been doing for years, which is just to think about these poverty, inequality, fiscal austerity issues linked to that. Anyway, just let me maybe contextualize what this degrowth looks like. Right now we've seen for Belgium decades of economic growth. Regardless of all the benefits they have brought, they have also fattened our economies, so we end up biophysically obese. The scientific term is ecological overshoot. Basically, we're here. We have overshot planetary boundaries. As I've shown here, you have a choice. Either you show you can keep doing that while just shifting completely here. In terms of speed and possibility, I've shown that I doubt this is possible. Or then you have to engage in a temporary macroeconomic diet. It's usually described as a planned downscaling of production and consumption. So just like economic growth, which is the end result of various phenomena, certain companies go bankrupt, certain stuff produce more, other less, certain stop consuming more, but the overall effect is at the end of this time period, your economy is bigger. Degrowth is just the opposite. You may have much more cargo bikes and much more this and that, but you will have much less of something else that will give the overall effect of a smaller economy, which we've seen will be easier to make sustainable. You don't do this forever, otherwise you just reach zero, the absence of an economy, and you disappear. So just like a diet, where you would not stop eating everything forever. Here, degrowth is a temporary selective selection of the more nature-intensive goods and services to facilitate the return to sustainability. And once you're here, I like to connect it with the concept of steady state. Very often, we often speak about post-growth. To be like, once you're here, then you're back to a kind of like economic activity as usual, where you have periods of regrowth, periods of degrowth, based on, well, ideally based on needs. You can increase your productive capacities, but your productive capacity is capped by the carrying capacity of your ecosystems. And your only way of pushing that boundary is technological progress. So other time, you invent new ways of, I don't know, recycling stuff, for example, that give you extra productive capacity. You can use it if you want, you don't have to, but you can. And on the other hand, if you have an ecosystem collapsing, water scarcity, well, that reduces your productive capacity in a way you cannot, negotiate with nature in a certain way. So phenomena of regrowth and degrowth within that kind of safe and just space. I think I've just overshot my 20 minutes, so I'll stop here, but I'm very much looking forward to discuss more.
All right, thank you very much for the kind invitation, for setting this up. Thank you for joining us this evening in this, and to the farm for hosting us. So I will do something a bit different from what Tim did. We didn't coordinate, so it makes sense that we are taking a bit different approaches. I'll go wide more than deep. He went on one specific issue. I'll give a bit of a broader overview, but you will see that there are some elements in common. Of course, I only have 20-ish minutes, so as a good economist, I will start with a set of assumptions. And the set of assumptions is the things that I will assume we agree on. So stuff that I hope you and I can agree on, but with the broader public, and of which I will not try to persuade you. The first being that climate change is real, is happening, and it is due to human activity and greenhouse gas emissions, that if left unattended, this will lead with increasing probability to extreme weather events, floods, droughts, sea level rising, and so on. I will assume that we value human life. This might sound as strange as an assumption of me having to put it there, but in this type of debates, sometimes we go off track. And so I will assume that that is the case. In order to avoid the worst, we need to decarbonize our economies. This is something that Tim already mentioned. This is something that you've probably heard, and that we take from the climate goals that originate from the Paris Agreement, or from targets that nations have agreed to. Broadly speaking, to decarbonize, to reach climate neutrality by 2050. It is, you will recognize the chart, you've seen it before. Climate change is one of the issues. It is not the only issue, and we have to be aware that there are other dimensions, and Tim already made this clear, so I can rest assured that this has been well covered. My overarching position, I have to be brief, and to a certain extent I have the benefit of the fact that my approach in a way coincides with the mainstream approach that governments in Europe, in the UK, in the US, in South Korea, in Japan are following to address these challenges, and so it is something that you will have already been exposed to. So I can be relatively brief, but my overarching approach is that in order to avoid these climate and environmental challenges, what we'll have to do is to restructure completely our economies. Effectively, switching or rolling out on a massive scale green technologies. In this, and I'm sure there will be plenty of room for discussion, I see capitalism as a potential ally. And potential is the word I want to underline, not because this is the magic silver bullet that will solve our problems, but rather because this is a machinery that has many issues and has centripetal forces, so it tends to generate inequalities and so on. But if there is one thing that it is good at, or has proven good at, is at fostering and churning out innovation. And so if it is that we need a lot of innovation and very fast, what I wonder and what I argue in my book is, why don't we find ways to harness this capacity in the direction that we care about? This is, and I underline this again, not going to happen on its own. It's not going to happen magically. You can sit back, relax, and capitalism is going to take care of all our environmental problems. It is not that, but rather let's discuss and figure out what are the measures that we can take to orient the economic machine and capitalistic system in the direction we care about. I live in Brussels, so I live in a policy bubble. Of course, there's the federal government, there is the European Union, and the Commission. And when I give these talks in policy circles, in policy cities, everybody is like, yeah, and governments have to do this and that, and regulation and carbon pricing, and absolutely. There is a strong role for governments, and I'm sure we're going to get into that further down in the conversation, but it does not stop at that. And I think this is important for you to understand that according to my view of these issues, governments alone cannot do this. They need the help of pioneering businesses. They need the help of citizens. And so we're talking of something that is closer to a whole-of-nation approach. To hit the nail on the head, the green growth discussion and whether green growth is possible and what is green growth and so on. To my mind, growth, economic growth at an abstract level, and so I'm not talking about GDP here, but economic growth as a concept is about generating value. Ideally, generating the creation of value, making desired things possible for as many as possible. So this is the operating definition with which I work for economic growth. And my view on these issues is that if nature is valued, or in the moment in which nature is increasingly being valued because we see the problems we've run into, people will be ready to pay more for the environmentally compatible option, whatever that is, depending on the field we're looking at. And so the drive towards climate neutrality or restoration of biodiversity loss and so on will generate value. And some companies will be at the forefront of this effort. And in doing this, they will effectively generate profits, which to my mind is fine. And there are other companies that instead will continue with the old ways, with the business as usual scenario. And in doing this, they will eventually or increasingly be seen as old, antiquated, engaging in businesses and trades that are of less interest. And so eventually they will face economic decline. And the interplay of these two dimensions will lead in equilibrium to a complete restructuring of the economy, which is what I was talking about. I'm glad that Tim already mentioned this, because a discussion, I have to say, there are some strong points in the degrowth school of thought, but one of the weakest ones that always appears is this idea that in a growing economy every sector grows, and so we don't need every sector to grow. I'm glad you already mentioned this. Actually, some sectors grow and some others don't, and that is fine. That is true in your view of degrowth. It is true, you said, in a growing economy, and so this is the rebalancing I'm talking about. Am I not the Dr. Pangloss of green growth? So, of course, this is a reference to the character of the Candide of Voltaire, and this character that was saying, we live in the best of possible worlds. And the fact that I am presenting this idea that we can grow green is overly optimistic, I am told at times, because I would be presenting us as in the best of possible worlds. This is not what I'm trying to say, and the difference is subtle. And I'm trying, this is the first time I use this visualization. It makes sense in my mind, but let's see if I can convey the meaning to you. The idea is that, to a certain extent, yes, we could have taken different choices back in time as a society. So I'm converting, let's say, a life hack type of chart to a society or to an economy. Yes, we could have been in other equilibria or other situations if, I don't know, electric vehicles had prevailed at the beginning of the 1900s vis-a-vis internal combustion engines, or income levels could be higher if World War II hadn't started, but that is not the point. The point is we are where we are, and stuff will be happening, some of it outside of our control, some of it within our control, and the quest for growth will be exactly our effort to try and resurface out of the situation where we're at the point where we're at right now, and we have to focus to a certain extent on the future. So for those in the room that are economists, growth to my mind is a local maximization problem, it's not a global maximization problem. One word on the future, given we are speaking about the future, and that often gets lost in translation. I have debates also with, let's say, fellow mainstream economists on this that I think are missing the point. And that is the future that awaits us. And to a certain extent, you touched upon this, which is the idea that the future will not look like the past, and that increasingly we know what it will look like because climate change is already materializing in the form of droughts, of floods, of wildfires, and we've seen that even just this summer. And so events like these will lead naturally to scarcity. So there will be a drop in production, and I suspect that there will be an effort to try and let's say, relift constantly ourselves out of this, out of these exogenous shocks. So you can focus on material well-being, or on non-material well-being and friendship and the 3 C's, I think Tim Jackson calls them, so care, craft, and culture, all you want, but at the end of the day, the future you have ahead of you is a future where we will be in the need of measures that help us contrast an increasingly unstable climate. And you need resources for that, you need a strong economy for that. The same message was sort of made in this chart, which you can't see, but effectively was saying that productivity in agriculture has already been reduced as a result of climate change. So the 1 degree Celsius that has increased, the temperature of the atmosphere has increased between 1961 and today, has already decreased agricultural productivity by a whole lot. And of course, with heterogeneity across countries. And the reason you have not observed this is that in parallel, TFP, agricultural TFP, was going up on aggregate because we were deploying innovation. We were deploying science and technology to try and contrast that. And so the future that we have ahead of us is one of an epic battle, let's say, between science and technology and our ability to deploy these tools and climate change materializing. And in a way, to my mind, this idea that we're going to switch to a kumbaya, care, craft, and culture economy within this environment is ill-posed. And that degrowth, to the extent that it could have been successful, and I doubt that even under, let's say, benevolent conditions in the plane of the Holocene, is probably unlikely to weather the storm in the Anthropocene. One word on the international dimension that usually comes up in these discussions, I was surprised you didn't mention it in your presentation, but again, I'm sure we're going to have occasion to discuss it, is, yeah, but you know, because of a variety of reasons, moral reasons, historical emissions, all of which is fair, so on all of which I can agree, rich countries should degrow, should transfer resources even more to poorer nations, because like this, developing economies have the resources to decarbonize and in parallel grow. This ain't gonna happen. Or it ain't gonna happen even barely scratching the surface of the problem. And this is what I'm trying to show here, in the sense that we are now more or less reaching the 100 billion which is what a set of developed countries had agreed to transfer to poorer nations. It was agreed to reach by 2020. We're in 2023 and we're not sure, maybe we've reached it. 80% of that, by the way, is loans, not grants, which is of course what you would have in mind when you speak of transfers. And what we're looking at instead is a 6 trillion envelope in terms of the resources that the developing nations would need, only to reach half of the goals they've pledged to under NDCs, so under nationally determined contribution. So we're not going to get anywhere close to it, and especially because in parallel, extreme weather events will materialize also in higher income nations, whether it is droughts in Spain, whether it is floods in Greece, whether it is floods in Emilia-Romagna in Italy. And so more pressure will be on the resources that rich high-income nations have rather than less. I'm sorry that you can't see the slides the way I would wish you to see them, but let's see if I can. It's unfortunate because this slide was exactly the one you showed. And so it is, this is the chart we're showing from Vogel and Hickel. And Vogel and Hickel indeed have this projection. You already explained it very well. And it helps me to make one point, which is, I often get criticized saying, but aren't you betting too much on technology? Aren't you too much of a techno-optimist, hoping that technology would magically solve the day? And to me, a chart like that of Vogel and Hickel that Tim already presented is odd in the fact that technology does not spread linearly. And we know that. There is no technology whatsoever, and this is what the chart on the right shows that you can't see. Technology spreads through S-curves, which means they start slow, they enter in an exponential curve, and when they reach market capacity, they sort of flatten out. And this is what I would expect to see with green technologies. As a matter of fact, is what we're seeing with green technologies. There's nothing new in solar panels. Wind rotors have been around for a very long time, but now we're entering into the exponential phase of their rollout. So yes, I would expect that, let's say, the pace of decarbonization will pick up, even just assuming that technology will spread as it did for the microwave, as it did with the telephone, as it did with the refrigerator, and a host of other technologies. One point that gets made is, and you already hinted at this, yeah, but in the process of decarbonizing, are we not, to a certain extent, worsening one problem? We go for decarbonization, and let's say we build all these solar panels or with these windmills, but this ends up requiring a host of resources and green minerals, and so implicitly we are worsening our impact on the other side. And of course, what I was trying to show in the chart below is that, yes, we will be mining to millions of tons of minerals, but this pales with respect to the scale of the amount of stuff that we're mining right now in the form of coal, in the form of petrol, in the form of methane. It is minuscule with respect to the amount of stuff we're taking from Earth. So yes, does it still have an impact? It does. But the point here is to minimize our impact on the planet, not to cancel it out completely, because no technology or no human action would have passed the test of not having any impact on the world whatsoever, not even the invention of fire 120,000 years ago, because that, of course, had an environmental impact as well. It was used in ancient times for slash and burn, so of course it was affecting biodiversity and land use. Sobriety. So wouldn't it be faster if people just gave up stuff? Which is a bit the idea, I think, at the heart of degrowth, and that mechanically is true. So of course, if people gave up stuff, yes, it would be easier to decarbonize, but the issue is that they won't. And the issue I have with this is that, in a way, when they observe that this is not happening, or that people are not willing to do that, part of this literature says, but people are victims of the system. People are trapped in the cage of consumerism or capitalism, as Tim Jackson would put it, And so they would like a life where less is more, and they know secretly that less is more, but they cannot because they're trapped in the system itself. Now the problem is that there is a cognitive bias that prevents us from this, which is loss avoidance. So people don't like to give stuff away. Once you feel that something is yours, it takes a lot to give it away, and people get pissed off when you take it away from them. And to a certain extent, the reason why I'm not holding my breath for the school of thought to persuade people en masse to realize that there is a superior form of living in terms of less is more, is that this type of thinking has been present in every single religion or major religion since the birth of time. And so you find it in Confucius, so you find it in Socrates, you find it in Christianism, you find it in Judaism, Buddhism. And to a certain, we can, I mean, I'm not going to call shots here, but you can tell that it has not altered completely the course of history. And so the more sobriety happens, the better. One argument that gets made at this point is, no, but it's sobriety for the rich. It's not for everybody. Everybody can be fine. It is the rich that have to change their pattern of consumption. And to make that point, typically a chart like this gets used. A chart from Oxfam saying, but you see the top 10%, the highest wealth people in the world are the ones that are burning, here looking at CO2 only, so the most CO2, 50% of CO2, so we have to force them to engage in sobriety. Now the issue is that if you look at the threshold to enter into that 10% of the richest that are destroying the planet, it's actually 137,000 euros. Which means I went through house prices throughout Belgium and through all the provinces of Belgium. Effectively a house, forget about it. So a house everywhere, the median value is above that. I've looked at apartments, Flanders, forget about it, Brussels, forget about it. I got the chart only for Wallonia, and indeed Waterloo, Braine-l'Alleud, Wavre, and so on, still above Charleroi. If you're in Charleroi, you're probably in the top 15% of wealth levels at global level instead of the top 10. But the point is that you cannot go to people like this, who, by the way, have nothing else under these assumptions, so no savings, no car, no stocks, no bonds, nothing else, because we're looking at aggregate wealth, and tell them, well, actually, you're going to have to pay and we're going to transfer your resources out, because people who are in the global wealthiest are actually the median or below the median, the bottom 50% of a country's population, and politics happens at the national level. So, albeit maybe in a global polity that doesn't exist, in a democracy, this redistribution would happen. At national level, it will not, and national level is where politics happens. But then why can't we just take the money out of billionaires? We know that we have these super wealthy individuals, so let's take those. Those surely we can do even within national politics. The problem is that there ain't enough. And so if we look at the investments that we need, even just in Europe, to reach decarbonization, we're looking at an investment gap, these are numbers from Bruegel, a think tank in Brussels, of 360 billion each year between now and 2030 to reach the goals only for 2030. After that, it's going to be more than that. If we take a look at the richest billionaires in Europe, we would need the top 6 only in the first year. And once we've erased their wealth, which by the way would be sold at under the value of it, but let's assume it doesn't, what do we do the year after, and the year after, and the year after? And of course, climate is only one of the, let's say, growing needs for finance. We have the digital transition and everything concerning that requires money and investment. We have aging that is requiring an increasing number of resources. We have defense, or the war in Ukraine, which is drawing in more resources. So the point being that we're entering into an environment of scarcity, and where more and more pressure will be put on the resources we have. And so I suspect, or I argue, that politically it would be very hard to push this idea that we have already enough and that we would just settle with what we have. Which is why I, to a certain extent, if Vogel and Hickel can refer to green growth as a sort of, I think they call it macroeconomic greenwashing, to a certain extent I feel that I can refer to degrowth as a weapon of mass distraction, in the fact that it does not propose realistic policy solutions to address the challenges that it correctly identifies. And so my final slide is a bit more personal, which is to say that for a long time I entered into a tunnel where I was reading all this degrowth literature and realizing that more and more people were reading and writing about this, and books were coming out, including your own, and they were bought, and in Japan, great success. So degrowth was growing as an intellectual movement, and because I disagreed with some of its premises, I was concerned. I've reached a point where I'm not concerned anymore. And the reason why I'm not concerned anymore is along 5 axes. The first being that, in a way, irrespective of its intellectual strength, and growing intellectual strength, and more debates and more discussion about it, and so on, politically, the movement looks to me in a dead alley. In the sense that we were talking about it a few minutes ago, there was this degrowth conference in Parliament, and it was seen as the Woodstock. It was called the Woodstock of degrowth, and so all happy, all these scholars talking to each other, but it felt more as a psychological session of people coming together who agree on this, but politically, even the European Parliament is not endorsing these positions. The conference was organized by Philippe Lambert, who declared that he's not running again. If at all, the next European elections are shifting in the opposite direction, which is an important point in the fact that if there is a clash between jobs or, let's say, the economy and nature, if it's seen like that, and I disagree with it, but for the conservatives, when I talk to the conservatives, I tell them this is not true, but if the framing is like that, the planet will lose. So if it is planet versus the economy, framed in this way, the planet will lose politically. And so this is not a good framing, and I disagree with that, and you can understand why we can talk about it. And the reason why, the reason for the political dead alley is that there is no theory of change, in the sense that it is an all or nothing approach, because although the policy recommendations of degrowth are varied, and it's broad, and it includes things like universal basic income, like a reduction of working hours, like a cap on maximum wages. There's a long list of things that are mentioned in this school of thought. Any step taken in that direction is not a step towards the goal, because if a capitalistic economy reduces working hours, which by the way it has over the past 200 years, it is shoring itself up. So it's not a step closer to the revolution against capitalism, it is capitalism reinforcing itself, and only tearing down the system will work. So it is an all or nothing strategy. It is not incentive compatible at international level, and I'm going to skip this, we can talk about it later. It bets on moral improvements, which is something that I told you has happened throughout history at various points, where we were hoping for humanity to become better, to realize the challenge, and then realize that there's something in the greater good. It hasn't happened, and so I fail to understand why it will right now. And finally, climate change and the broader sense of history, because of the reasons I was telling you, are pushing in the opposite direction. One of greater resource scarcity, which is why I suspect we are shifting in the other direction of trying to get more growth, to get us out, local maximization problem, to get us out of where we are. So the success that the movement will have is that it will persuade some people to change their consumption habits. It will persuade some people to engage in more minimalism, to give up their car, to use their bike, and I'm perfectly happy with that. The more you're succeeding in this, the more I wish you luck, because to my mind, sobriety taken at individual level is very good, and so if you manage to persuade more people for that, that is fine by me, and I will stop here. This is the book, and these are my references. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Alessio, thank you very much, Timothée, for this brilliant presentation. There's a lot to discuss. We don't have time to discuss everything. We'll do our best. Maybe you have already seen a cartoon saying that I would like to live in theory, because in theory everything works. One of the remarks of Alessio was that degrowth supporter would focus on what should happen, what in theory we should go for to solve the environmental challenge that we face. They focus on what should rather than what will happen. And he went even further, saying that degrowth is a source of mass destruction. What would you answer to that?
Well, I think there's a slight mischaracterization of what degrowth is. Degrowth has been used by a variety of people. Indeed, a global movement, but there is also just a science behind. And as such, I mean, it's not like we have developed thousands of researchers that are just, building castle in the sky just for the pleasure of just contemplating something that will just never happen. So we're just the very same. Social scientists are trying to find solutions to problems we've not managed to solve. And I think in the kind of policy recommendations we make, let it be in Alessio's research on industrial policy and my stuff on kind of degrowth policies, or just, we identify a problem, we try to find a solution. That's step number one. On theory, it works, okay? Like, on theory, this would work. Then second step is like, okay, how will we convince people that this is actually can be operationalized in reality? And I don't think we should rush into confusing this straight away. Like, the political framing of degrowth, which I agree with you, Alessio, is not the sexiest term ever. And I agree also with the risk of the rise in extreme right and that kind of framing. But starting with, like, the science about it, before we talk about framing, I think it's very important to be lucid about the reality which we get from sustainability science and ecological economics. So for me, when I call it degrowth, it's just because it's a reduction in production and consumption. Like, I could call it like a well-being combined economy. Like, maybe that will just sell it better. But at the end of the day, it's just an economy that is producing and consuming less. That's what it is. That I've just been defending. I think this could take a variety of forms. And I think depending on that variety of forms, you talked about the rebalancing on certain sectors' growth or their degrowth. We agree, I think the only difference is that you expect that out of these rebalancing of the proportion of different sectors, national income will be higher. And for me, I expect the opposite. Out of this restructuration, I guess we'll agree on like what kind of sector need to grow and other will need to degrow. I'm sure I've read your research on industrial policy and I'm sure we'll agree on that. Except for me, I'm expecting a lower national income. And here I just want to make a point. I was very surprised that you open up by defining economic growth as an increase in value, which is strange. Strange in a way, because I think the operating definition of economic growth is just it's an increase in gross domestic product, right? Which, when it was invented, was a proxy using that concept of added value. We have a national accounting to estimate the level of production of an economy. But I think it's a bit of a stretch to just go and say like, well, growth is not just an increase in GDP, it's just a creation of value. Because in defining as like this, you make it very much possible then to say that value can take any other form. But the stuff we measure as GDP is a very specific form of value. So Tim Jackson, for example, in his CCC economy, is going to say, you know what, we're going to certain commodities are going to disappear because people are going to, let's say, they're going to work less, and in their leisure, instead of just buying monetary commodities, which gets counted in GDP, they'll spend more time with their kids or doing whatever else, writing books and stuff like this, doing podcasts. And so, in general, the kind of monetary transactions, so income levels, will be lower, even though it tells us nothing about value creation. Same thing about ecosystems. I'm surprised we cannot, like, but maybe I'm too long already. I can come back to that later, to the kind of value we ascribe to nature and why not all ecological value can translate into the kind of profit you talked about that will give incentives for companies to kind of act up.
Thank you very much, Timothée. Alessio, I have a question for you. So one of the statements of Timothée, the first one is that there is a fundamental incompatibility with growth and planetary limits. Do you agree with this? And from what you said, it seems you recognize it, but at the same time, you think growth is still our best allied. Capitalism is still our best allied. But aren't we doomed? See, if at the same time there exists a big incompatibility, and despite this incompatibility, our best way to answer our challenge is to go for growth.
Yes. So there's yes, a lot of material. So I will answer you to get to your question, which is value and this idea of what is economic growth and what is GDP. Now, this is something I devote a lot of time to in my work as well, that I see you read with great interest, which is, to my mind, growth is the concept, GDP is the statistical artifact that tries to measure, to capture the concept. Sometimes it does a good job at it, sometimes it does a crap job at it. You have in mind nature, but there are other domains where we know that it doesn't track very well the size of the economy. Services is one of these, digital services is one of these, and there's a lot of let's say, interest on that. Now, what will happen to GDP is an issue, let's say, an issue of research, and people are looking at it, and whether GDP measures the right things, and how we can reframe it, or how we can complement it. This is a stream of work, but to my mind is less interesting, because I'm less interested in the statistical artifact, and I'm interested more in the phenomenon. And the reason why I say this is that growth, as you know very well, did not start when we started measuring it. Mm-hmm. So growth did not start with GDP. GDP started being measured in the 1930s. Growth, even if we assume, I would disagree with that, but even if we assume that it started with the Industrial Revolution, started 150 years before that. And growing immensely, let's say, or very strongly. And so I'm more interested in the concept than in the statistical tool. On that we can discuss, and you can tell me, but natural capital is not factored into it very well. Okay, we can talk about it if you want, but I think it's less interesting. Now you tell me, yeah, but we are measuring only the value of stuff you can sell, so transactions. And on this you're right, because even economic growth looks at the economy, and the economy is about the transactions. It is not about the acts of love or the gifts and so on. To a certain extent, I'm less interested in that, or I think that there has been less interest in that, in the sense that you cannot organize an economy based on voluntary acts beyond extremely low levels of complexity. And so that eventually, very fast, very quickly, you start looking at economic transactions, because that's when you can specialize. And we give lectures, others have chicken in their yard, and we give a lecture, they give us a chicken, and we have a transaction. So even without money, you can do that with relative prices. Now, with that in mind, are we doomed or are we not doomed? So I think that we can generate value, defined in this way, and therefore have economic growth while respecting planetary boundaries. Again, this will not happen. I don't think that this will happen magically. I think that this will happen as an active effort of humans, channeled by in the way in which we organize ourselves in firms, and that those firms will experience value creation, and that is a form of value creation that is seen as superior, and so the stuff that goes away will be less than the stuff that grows, effectively. Because we see value in nature, we see this as an objective. If I am wrong, and this is an interesting question, I don't know if that is what you were getting at, but I think that if I am wrong, and so that we're not, this is not possible, it's not possible at the speed required, as you were hinting at, the scenario we have ahead is not one where, again, we come all together as humanity or as a nation and we share more of what is left, but rather we're re-entering into an environment of scarcity, and scarcity of resources comes with conflict over resources. And so to a certain extent, I would say that not only for myself, but also others should hope that I'm right, because the scenario where I'm wrong is worse, is even worse. Let's stop there.
Thank you very much. I have many questions, but I will just ask two more. A short one. I will ask you to be short in the answer. They're a bit more concrete. Alessio, you have doubt about sobriety, and you advocate maintaining and adapting the current economic system based on market economy and entrepreneurial freedom. But haven't we gone too far when it comes to individual freedom? More specifically, we know very well that the free market encourages mass consumption and even overconsumption, which is harmful to the environment. To give an answer on this in 2 minutes?
2 minutes. Yes, so I am not against the sobriety per se. I think I was hinting at it at the end of my talk. The more people are willing to engage in it, the better. I just don't, not holding my breath for sobriety to be the main channel to achieve this. And I think that this is ultimately one of the crucial points where, let's say, we disagree with our sort of worldviews. We both think that technology plays a role and sobriety plays a role. It is just that if for you sobriety plays 80% and technology 20%, for me they're sort of inverted. I'm making these percentages up, but to give you a sense. Now, can we intervene with prices, with regulation? Because at the end of the day, people engage in behaviors that are detrimental to society. Now, the problem I have with this is that, in general, right now, that we're currently living in a fossil fuel civilization, practically everything we do, in one way or another, directly or indirectly, generates CO2 emissions. And so if the parameter is affecting society, or our children and grandchildren, and so on, by generating CO2 emissions and warming the atmosphere, right now this would constitute a ground for intervening in everybody's, every single decision of everybody. And I don't think that that is desirable. That being said, I am normally seen already as a sort of hippie economist within the mainstream, because I'm all for the use of regulation. I'm all for the use of taxation. And the way I read these phenomena or these policy tools through is, does this harm innovation? Does this foster it or not? And I'm always looking at ways, rather than fencing out a certain consumption, as can we push even the richest, even those that are engaging in these behaviors, to invest in the green alternative? Can we get in their way with regulation so that we are pushing them to get to invest or to buy the green alternative, so that it makes it scalable and it makes it cheaper eventually along cost curves and eventually available to all? And I stop there.
Can I respond very quickly?
Go ahead.
Just on this balance between efficiency and sufficiency, what you said about technology and sobriety, the way I see it is there's a problem of reversibility, which means, like, right now, if we go for degrowth, let's take something very concrete, aviation. First, there are certain sectors, and they happen to be the sectors with the heaviest ecological footprint, where there are no technological alternatives yet. But the problem is that we need to reduce impact today. Actually, we need it yesterday. So my thing is just like, realistically, if right now I have to make a policy recommendation to shrink, the emissions of the aviation sector, I don't have much tool in my belt. But the issue of reversibility is important. If I tell you, like, okay guys, if you want to reach that climate target, you need to fly 50% less plane. That's striking, that's brutal, you're organizing the way you want, but it's reversible. If next year, if in 10 years, you invent some carbon removal technology, you invent a green plane, you can just fly twice more plane, no problem. But that's not true with the opposite approach, to be like, we keep flying more planes, we emit more carbon, greenhouse gases, then we degrade a complex ecosystems, which is exogenous to the economy. It's something we cannot fix, regardless of the money we have. Then that's a problem, it's irreversible. And also there's a hierarchy of facility, in the sense of, that's the saying of the most sustainable resources, the one you don't need to use. And that's even the IPCC approach of, making the difference between avoid, shift, and improve. Everything we can avoid, all the, car trips we can avoid having, great. That means that less stuff we will have to shift, from car to train, for example, and even less stuff we will have to improve, the very engine of the very car that would remain. So here, I think, like, the steps, they come in different orders. There's no point to be like, okay, right now we need to improve every single engine of every single thing we produce and just throw technological innovation at everything, which would be a waste of our neurons and limited energy. Better to be, these can be phased out, these are going to be shifted, and then we focus the entirety of our innovative resources in improving challenges.
Thank you very much. I think we are already well over time, so I suggest now to open the floor to the public. For question, please raise your hand. I'm sorry, I don't see very well the room, but Pierre will give you the micro.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the presentations and the debate. I'm here, second row. You have mentioned GDP growth. You have mentioned innovation and technology.
You're talking to me,
both of you, yes. But you have forgotten a third elephant in the room, which is population.
I was thinking, please don't say population.
Sorry. Wait. All the climate models are based on assumptions for pathways on these three variables. Something as well known as the cadre identity is also based on population, GDP growth per capita, and innovation. And when we look at the components of the cadre identity, we see that if we want to reduce emissions, we have to reduce population. It's really the elephant in the room.
It was in the 1970s, so that's a vintage question, which I think has lost complete relevance today. On two grounds, I'll say very quickly, I'm not an expert on the nexus between demography and climate, but some people are. Emmanuel Pont, for example, in France. Demography is neither the problem nor the solution when we talk about climate breakdown or any other ecological issues you can think of that we've been discussing today. It's not the problem because you have no correlation between demography and ecological footprint. As a matter of fact, and both Alessio and I have been presenting these numbers about environmental inequality, it's always highly concentrated, globally, regionally, nationally, even at the level of a city. So if your level, if what you identify, you're looking for just the number of the people, you're not going to see the emissions. So not the right way of identifying the problem. And even though that was the problem, then demography is not an effective policy lever because it's slow. You decide to have less kids, which is the only thing you can do demography-wise. That span over a generation, that's 24 years. We have a deadline for 2030. And I will add something, which for me I find quite important. We've talked about the economy. I think we have a different definition, but I think we would agree that at the end of the day, the economy is here for satisfying needs. It's kind of a way of organizing the material requirements for well-being. So if you have a limited biophysical budget, let's say we have it, imposed or chosen, and you have to decide of all the things you could do in life, like I find it rather strange that, you know, the ability to just have a family comes up in the discussion before we talk about meat, aviation, you know, SUVs, advertising, you know, all kind of other stuff. So, not a problem, not a solution. I don't know if you agree.
Surprisingly, yes. Yes, I mean, yeah, he already said it, which is to a certain extent I don't cover. It's not something I look at very much because I look for solutions. And to my mind, there is what Tim was mentioning, which is the horizons you're looking at when you're trying to intervene on demography or in the decades, well beyond the horizons we've given ourselves in terms of climate objectives or environmental objectives. And so, I mean, it's not a variable. Within the horizon I'm looking at, it is a constant, it's not a variable. And second, from a policy perspective, I wouldn't know what to do with it. In the sense that you can call me old school, but I still believe that governments shouldn't encroach with your desire to have kids or not, or tell you how many you're allowed to have. And so I don't see it as a variable for that reason as well.
Hi, my question is more maybe for Alessio.
You're Italian.
I'm Italian. So, brick growth sounds in theory great, and I think that would be ideal. Then the terms value, I think, opens a lot of questions because I think we might value different things, and there I'm thinking of Mariana Mazzucato and kind of all the discussions. But what I was more thinking is, I have the impression we're talking about it since a long time. In practice, not an aggregate, you know, country level, which example in practice we have of somewhere that it worked? At a community level, city level, borough level, like, is there something concrete?
I mean, this is a bit the point that Tim was making in his critique, which is, if it's happening too slow, and if you project trends, it's not enough. And if you look at it in aggregate, it's not enough as well, because we're still increasing material consumption and so on. So, no, there are no examples, at least not to the extent that we need them to be. Okay. Now, why do I think that there will be? It's because again, maybe old school economist, but I still believe in incentives. And right up until very recently, it's unfortunate to admit, but nature was seen as a trash can, and the atmosphere was not seen as a problem whether it was warming up or not. I've entered this space, I'm a relatively young writer, relatively young in this space. So in my working time, the focus on the environment has been strong, and the focus on climate change has been strong. The battles of whether climate change was happening or not have happened. I haven't been part of them, luckily, or had to take part in them. My impression is that the more we focus on them, and we are increasing focus because there is a call from people who are genuinely concerned, and they're right, the more we will take, let's say, policy tools, companies taking steps, and citizens taking steps along the lines of the whole of nation approach I was talking about. And so we haven't seen it because it was not a priority, and it was not seen as value creation or as a value, if not by small amounts of people. So there are those that approach me at the end of these debates, and they're like, but in the 70s I was one of those that went back to the farms, and yeah, I mean, that's great, but as unfortunate as it sounds, that was not the predominant mood for a very long time within society, and I think that that's why we haven't seen it yet.
Hello, thank you very much for the debate. It was really interesting. I have maybe a stupid question, as I'm not an economist, but I will ask it anyway. Do we have to fix this policy objective of green growth or degrowth? Why don't we agree on let's start producing less of this because we know it's bad for these and those planetary boundaries. Let's start decreasing this other stuff, and we will see whether it leads to degrowth or green growth.
Do you want me to start? Okay, so it has to do with an economic system is a very sophisticated thing, and so there are incentives in place that frame behavior. So, for example, the for-profit business model is one specific institutional framework to organize production. If you're a for-profit car manufacturer and your legal objective is to maximize the profit of the stuff you sell, unless a government comes and tell you, like, you have to stop producing SUVs, guys, I mean, we don't need them. But you're going to be like, well, that's the SUV lines in most automobile manufacturers today is the most added value product they have. So they'll say, no, we would be shooting ourselves in the foot. And actually the government maybe will also develop an argument and be like, well, when we sell SUVs, we have some value-added tax money and somehow that helps us to finance some stuff, so there's a bit of a nexus. The government also tries to maximize GDP. So you see here, in that context, it's very difficult all of a sudden to decide to be like, let's produce less. So for me, I mean, what I've been developing in my book and my thesis when I say that the economic implication is, okay, if we start from this and we say we need to stop massively producing less of certain things, then we won't be able to do it in today's system. So what do we need to change? And in my thesis, when I identified all the things we need to change, actually ended up removing most of the institutions that constitute capitalism. Because, I mean, we've not defined what capitalism is, but capitalism is a specific economic system that can be economic systems that are not capitalist. It's not only communism, it can be a variety, actually there's even a variety of capitalisms. But I think we would agree that it's based on a few institutions, the private means, the private ownership of the means of production, very often organized around lucrativity, their sales on markets, and so using markets as allocative systems. You also use very often general currency as a way of facilitating this exchange, and also most of the work to run that economy is organized as wage labor, meaning work is also allocated within a market. And when I worked on my thesis, I'm like, okay, if we want to be able to do that degrowth, we need to take away the for-profit motive within company. Okay, we lose that. And then I'm like, maybe one general currency is a bit of a problem when you want to grow certain sectors and degrow. So maybe complementary currencies could be a solution, alternative currencies here and there. So we lose the kind of general currency. The job market is going to be very difficult to keep because in a capitalist economy, when production shrinks, well, for-profit companies that see labor as a cost, they will fire you, because why would they keep you if they don't need you? So maybe we need to decommodify some part of labor, job guarantee, this kind of stuff, public jobs, then we lose another leg. Same thing, like, okay, well, markets, they're great for allocation, for certain things, they're efficient, but for other things, they suck. Allocation of scarce resources without price, for example, very difficult to use on markets because you have no price, you have no clearly identifiable biodiversity, for example. So for this, we need more